If you're here, you already sense there's something out there, something magical and mysterious, just waiting for you to find. And you've probably already discovered it isn't as easy as just thinking happy thoughts. You're not alone. Generations of shamans, philosophers, seers, and scientists have pursued this eternal quest. Where their ideas come together, you'll find powerful tools to cultivate magic and self-mastery in your own life. Welcome to the Magic and Mastery Podcast. I'm your host, Donna Woodwell. I'm a former journalist and author, a master astrologer, and a hermetic initiate, and it's my honor to be your guide. In each episode, I'll meet you at the crossroads of science and spirit, reason and intuition, to help you discover the wisdom that works for you. Are you ready? The adventure awaits. Hello and welcome back to the Magic and Mastery Podcast. This is episode 29, Why Alchemy is Cool. And cool it is. I have been waiting to do this episode for so long now. And it's finally time to get to talk about one of my favorite things, alchemy. Now, you might be wondering why I'm so jazzed. So, to keep myself from wandering all over the place, I actually made myself a handful of notes to share with you some of my thoughts about why I wish everyone was still studying alchemy, because it can be such a powerful tool for our personal transformation. Not just our spiritual transformation, but also our transformation for how we relate to the world at large. But before I dive in to my exploration of the chemical subject, just remind you to make sure you surf on over to www.magicandmastery.com/podcast, because that's where I put up all of the timestamps and any links that I mention in the course of this show, so you can find them in one easy place. So that's www.magicandmastery.com/podcast. And now, the alchemy that at least I have been waiting for. So let's start with this simple. What is alchemy? Besides one of my favorite things. Alchemy is considered one of the Hermetic arts. Now, the Hermetic arts are part of the Western tradition on how we both connect to the divine spark within ourselves, but also how we learn how to use our connection to the divine spark to create in our lives. That's basically the essence of what all Hermetic things do. And there are many things that are part of the Western esoteric tradition, but the three big pillars that are considered the Hermetic spirit sciences are astrology, alchemy, and this thing called theurgy. And theurgy is just the practice of magic to help us create rituals to reunite with the divine. And something like Kabbalah would be considered part of theurgy. Now, when I say these three pillars, they even had names. Typically, they called alchemy the operation of the sun, because it helps refine our dross metals into the spiritual sun of our own divine spark. Astrology was considered the operation of the moon, because the moon is changeable and the sky is also changeable. And the operation of the stars was related to the theurgic components. Okay, alchemy is also a spirit science. What exactly does that mean? All right. Today, we talk about science, the experimental method, as an intellectual exercise for the relationship between the mind and the physical part of matter. We measure things, and if we can't measure them, it's not real. That's what we think about when we say science. But science wasn't always conceived of in that mechanical, material way. So a spirit science uses the same tools of self-observation and measurement to see how things work, but the object of study isn't some dead thing that doesn't mind being cut up and measured, but a live, living, organic cosmos of which all things are connected. It's why modern science has such a hard time with things like alchemy and astrology, because alchemy and astrology make zero sense unless you presume a spiritual underpinning to all things and that all things are alive and in conversation with that spiritual underpinning. So astrology and alchemy are alike in the sense that they're both spirit science. But the real difference today is a result of the history of the interaction we've had with alchemy and astrology. Now, alchemy fell out of practice almost completely, at least in the popular mind, with the scientific revolution. Alchemy morphed into the more respectable form of chemistry. And even though astrology also went through a similar process, morphing into the socially acceptable form that we call astronomy today, astrology still retained its popular flair. There were almanacs on astrology written in the 19th century, but by the early 20th century, astrology columns and horoscopes were still around and still one of the most popular things that people would read in mass market publications. So everyone's always been able to say, hey, baby, what's your sign? And so astrology in the 20th century morphed into something more like psychology and less like an experimental science, whereas alchemy and its practice kind of remained frozen in time in its Renaissance era format, even though, just like in astrology, there are astrology associations and people who get together and talk astrology. There are also alchemy associations and people who get together and talk about alchemy and their alchemical experiments. And so it's still around. It's just not as publicly visible as astrology is. It's not as pop-oriented, which in my book is a real shame. Let me tell you why. And so that's how alchemy fits into the pattern of the Western esoteric tradition. But what exactly is it? Well, on a basic level, it's the study of how things transform. Things transform from one thing to another thing. Alchemy has been around, probably as long as humans have been around, but the formal tradition that began what was known as alchemy in Western Europe began back with the Egyptians and the rest of the Hermetic arts. And I especially love alchemy because most ancient alchemists recognize that the first alchemist who formalized the study of how we observe the natural world in order to understand how things transform was Maria the alchemist, sometimes called Maria the Jewess, Maria the prophetess, depends on who you're talking to. But isn't that cool? It's a Western esoteric tradition that those practicing recognized that a woman was the inspiration behind. So think of that when you are considering your alchemical practice. And so it has always had a connection to the household, to things that you're cooking in the kitchen, and how that spills beyond the crafts that you make in the world. But alchemy also goes beyond just the physical. Because remember, it's a spirit science. And so the idea was that things that happen on the outside have a corollary for something that's happening on the inside of us. And so part of the alchemical process is recognizing as you are creating, as you are doing your weaving, as you are doing your cooking, as you are working with your plants, whatever you're doing, you are also kind of entering a meditative state, especially with things that have a repetitive side to them. And in that state, you begin to understand how the process of what you are creating in the world is related to how you are creating yourself. Which, again, is an incredibly useful thing to think about in our modern world where we focus on work and work and work and work to the detriment of other things, if we could just bring that one thought in, that everything we do has spiritual echoes, we might see the work we do in the world a little differently. Back in the day, when alchemy was being invented, so to speak, there was a pervasive idea that all things that exist are evolving toward perfection. That we are all striving to become more whole, more perfect, or more godlike, so to speak. And this desire for perfection could be seen in all things, whether it is human or animal or plant or even mineral. Yes, there was the belief that if the rocks were left in the ground long enough, they too would evolve. They would transform into some higher, more perfect, more purified version of themselves. And so base matter or lead would turn into tin. The tin would eventually become copper. Copper would turn into silver, and silver would eventually work its way to becoming gold. For plant alchemy, same thing. Plants were also evolving into something more. Now today, plant alchemy is sometimes called spagyrics in order to differentiate it from the mineral side of alchemy. And spagyrics is just another word that means to draw out or assemble that's been associated with alchemy. Now, before you laugh at all these ideas that the ancients had about everything evolving, consider what has happened in the interim. In the 19th century, Charles Darwin went out to create a very compelling theory that humans and plants are evolving. We may not be getting more perfect, but we are getting better suited to our environments slowly over time, which is not that different from the concepts that the ancients had. Or if you say, well, that can't possibly apply to rocks, I say, au contraire, because if you think about it, today's chemistry and our nuclear physics programs are capable of transmuting one element into another. We can turn lead into gold quite literally. The only reason we don't do it to make more gold is because it's more expensive to create the science and the conditions to make the gold than it is to just dig the gold up out of the ground. So if that's the only thing that stops us, perhaps we shouldn't scoff at the way the ancients were viewing the world. Oh, and by the way, they did call it the operation of the sun. You might think of that as odd. Why would alchemy get to be the operation of the sun? Well, on one hand, on the basic level, the object was to turn lead into gold, and gold is associated with the sun. It's the sun metal. So there's that level. But even that, our modern science posits that every single thing you see, whether it's the rocks and the stones, the pets, I'm looking at my dog right now, the plants, everything, if you can touch it, if you can breathe it, all of those molecules that make up everything we know, were all born in the heart of the sun. Or a sun, at least. Think about that. We are all made of star stuff, or sun stuff, if you prefer. And that is what alchemy seeks to find, to understand how things transform on the outer level so that we can understand how we transform on an inner level. Well, after all this, it should not surprise you that in a very real way, the way of thinking that the alchemists and even the astrologers created about how we observe the material world eventually led to what we consider modern science. And they were observing what happened around them because they had this notion. If everything is evolving by itself, maybe if we understand the process, we can perhaps accelerate it, or maybe do it artificially. Therefore, we could create gold from lead. Or if we could understand how this process is working, we could go even beyond that and find more magical applications as we learn how to work the link between the physical and the metaphysical, or the spiritual, if you prefer. Now, this process known as alchemy had lots and lots of practical applications. It led to the creation of metals, brass and tin and bronze and even steel. Eventually, all of that came out of the work that was being done by alchemists. Also, a whole thread of how we come up with the chemicals that would eventually become chemistry, pharmacology. They still call chemists in other English-speaking countries besides the United States. And while perhaps even 30 years ago, science would have poo-pooed alchemy, people are coming up through the academy who are finally starting to study who the alchemists were and what they were doing. And even some of them are reproducing alchemical experiments, translating the words they were using into chemical language, finding the ingredients that were accessible at the time, and realizing that they weren't just making up fanciful documents, they were actually instructions. If you use the right equipment and you follow the procedures correctly, would produce measurable results. In their studies, alchemists were learning things like the importance of documenting your work, general lab procedures. They even came up with special processes that were known as the sacred stages of alchemy. Sometimes there were 7, sometimes there were 12 or 9. The stages don't matter. What matters is what they were and the impact they would have on later chemistry. Now, these were things like calcination, which is burning something and reducing it to ash, dissolution, separation and conjunction, fermentation and distillation, things that give us wine and stuff, and so on, all the way till the final radiance of the substance being transformed. But that's not all. Each one of these chemical processes had a more psychological or a spiritual implication. That's because, again, alchemy was a spirit science, so they didn't separate out the physical from the non-physical the way we have in modern Western culture since the scientific revolution. While the alchemist was going through each of these stages, they were meditating on how the process was reflected in their inner world. And they were working to transform the baser aspects of the self into spiritual gold. In other words, alchemy is about making better humans. And, I'm a big fan of making better humans. Lots of folks, even after alchemy fell out of favor as a science, were still interested in this spiritual side of alchemy. Not the least of which was Carl Jung. The transpersonal psychologist wrote 2-volume study on alchemy and how the images related in alchemical and how the images in alchemical texts related to archetypal images embedded deeply within the collective unconscious. In alchemy, Jung saw his process for what he called self-actualization revealed in a symbolic form, which is pretty darn amazing. But to Jung, it was still a spiritual or a symbolic metaphor. Just because it can be true physically and it can be true spiritually doesn't mean that we can't still go back to alchemy and work on the process the way the ancient alchemists would have done it, which is to actually do the experiments and watch ourselves, to meditate with them while we are doing them It's like an intensified mindfulness meditation. A mindfulness meditation that has a specific focus of what we are working on as a key step in our own self-transformation. In their studies, alchemists were learning things like the importance of documenting your work, general lab procedures. They even came up with special processes that were known as the sacred stages of alchemy. Yeah, sometimes there were 7, sometimes there were 12 or 9. The stages don't matter. What matters is what they were and the impact they would have on later chemistry. Now, these were things like calcination, which is burning something and reducing it to ash, dissolution, separation and conjunction, fermentation and distillation, things that give us wine and stuff, and so on, all the way till the final radiance of the substance being transformed. But that's not all. Each one of these chemical processes had a more psychological or a spiritual implication. That's because, again, alchemy was a spirit science, so they didn't separate out the physical from the non-physical the way we have in modern Western culture since the scientific revolution. And so while the alchemist was going through each of these stages, they were meditating on how the process was reflected in their inner world. And they were working to transform the baser aspects of the self into spiritual gold. In other words, alchemy is about making better humans. And, I'm a big fan of making better humans. Lots of folks, even after alchemy fell out of favor as a science, were still interested in this spiritual side of alchemy. Not the least of which was Carl Jung. The transpersonal psychologist wrote 2-volume study on alchemy and how the images in alchemical texts related to archetypal images embedded deeply within the collective unconscious. In alchemy, Jung saw his process for what he called self-actualization revealed in a symbolic form, which is pretty darn amazing. But to Jung, it was still a spiritual or a symbolic metaphor. Just because it can be true physically and it can be true spiritually doesn't mean that we can't still go back to alchemy and work on the process the way the ancient alchemists would have done it, which is to actually do the experiments and watch ourselves, to meditate with them while we are doing them. It's like an intensified mindfulness meditation. A mindfulness meditation that has a specific focus of what we are working on as a key step in our own self-transformation. And now maybe you understand why I am so very jazzed about the concept of what alchemy is. Especially since I grew up in my metaphysical sense, focused on astrology. And astrology is lovely. I love the stars. But astrology is fond of saying that whenever something is happening in the sky, you have a choice to express the energies in a skillful manner or express the energies in an unskillful manner. And you get to choose between the two of them. Well, that's all fine to say, except that it doesn't always work because people ask, how do I do that? How do I transform myself so that I can be more skillful? And that theoretical understanding is often lost in modern astrology. It's just glossed over. Of course, just having awareness of the situation can often help you make better choices. But still, modern Western astrology by itself lacks its own process of how things transform. And the reason for that is all of that knowledge is locked up over in alchemy. Alchemy uses the language of astrology to talk about how things transform. And so you couldn't have learned how to be an alchemist without first having been an astrologer. That's why astrology is the operation of the moon, whereas alchemy is the operation of the sun. It is the perfection of astrology in the material world that they're looking for. I mean, alchemy was all about the sacred marriage of the sun king and the moon queen in order to create an alchemical child, the synthesis of the two. Some would later call the philosopher's stone, something that would bring you closer to the immortality of the gods. In alchemy, we saw the metaphysical understanding of the Hermeticists, that the divine images, types, and patterns of all things existed on an abstract layer, and that it was imprinted in our physical world in order to find a way to bridge the gap between the two of them. And in alchemy, this is translated into sulfur, the agent with the archetypal power, and salt, the physical matter which is being transmuted, and the mercury, the fluid soul stuff that's moving between the two of them. All of this talk about alchemy points to the hidden truth in the discipline, the recognition that we as human beings have to learn how to resolve the paradox that we live in polarity. You cannot have a sense of me-ness without having a sense of you-ness. It's just not possible. And so for every hot, there's a cold. For every up, there's a down. It is the nature of a physical existence. But it requires us to learn how to navigate that skillfully, to find the middle path, to successfully learn how to integrate our spiritual selves into our physical selves. And that's what alchemy gives us, a set of tools to teach us how to move between these different disparate parts of ourselves. An entire toolkit built in. Really, the toolkit that astrology would have come with had you learned astrology 500 years ago. And it's through the application of these tools that we go through a process of refinement, of purifying ourselves, getting it right better and better each time around so that we end up with a more rarefied state. We become more like the spiritual gold that is so sought after. Really, it's a process that's very much like life, only accelerated, because you are doing it with conscious awareness and assisting with the process. And so, this is why I am so excited I get to spend 2022 as the year of alchemy, going on an alchemical journey with all of you. Now, I am a little over 2 years into my grand 5-year plan for creating Magic School. And we've been spending a lot of time over the past years creating the foundation for our alchemical studies. We have needed to cover a lot of ground just to make sure everyone coming to these studies have what they need. I've done 36-hour-long trainings on how to dive deeper into magic and theurgy and divination, all things that are useful in alchemy. I have done longer trainings on the planetary magic and astrology that are so essential to those who are integrating the two in their alchemical practice, that it is time for us to dive even deeper into the heart of the experience of Hermeticism, and that's learning how to use all the tools to transform ourselves. Now, I thought about different ways that I could deliver this course on alchemy. I could have done it like one of my 12-week crash courses like I did for astrology or like I did for tarot. The problem is alchemical experiments, chemically speaking, since we'll be focusing mostly on the spagyric side of the equation, plant alchemy is a little bit safer than mineral alchemy. But some of those experiments take a while. They take days or weeks to fully mature. So you're meditating with them over time. It's not something that can practically be done in just a week. And so for that, I decided maybe a better way to do this as a course is to embed it in my Magic and Mastery Coven. That's my membership program where everyone is coming month to month to celebrate the season, celebrate the turning of the moon, but also to learn and explore magic together. And so our 12-session alchemy course, instead of being a 12-week course, is going to become a 12-month course. So there's plenty of time within to do the experiments. And so I've been racing and wrapping things up to make sure that I can start fresh with the new year in January, begin a 12-month exploration of alchemy and what it means to transform ourselves. That our coven members can have time to develop the lab practices and discuss their experiences together, because it's always fun to have lab partners, right? And even though we're not starting until January, if this is something you know you want to do, and come on, let's face it, if you know you want to do this, you know you want to do this. I want to do this, and I know I want to do this. So if you're in that category of no doubts, you absolutely want to sign up, do it now, because for the next few days, the coven is covered under the 25% discount for the holiday season. So if you use the code Holiday Love, you can go to www.magicandmastery.com/coven and get your annual membership for the coven at 25% off. It works out to be something like $28 a month instead of the regular $47. And so not only are you getting the alchemy course included in that payment, you are also getting access to the 3 other 12-week courses that are already in the coven, nice and complete, waiting for you to binge watch whenever you have time. You're getting the full moon and the new moon ceremonies, plus the seasonal ceremonies, plus monthly divinations, plus an additional collection of another 30 half-hour ceremonies that I recorded just for your own spiritual edification. Plus, you get, as a bonus, a copy of the Book of Shadow Secrets. All of that for one simple price. So again, if you know already that you want to explore this magical thing called alchemy, if you want to get a sense of what all of those mysterious symbols that you see in alchemical texts mean, if you want to dive into the history of alchemy and what the alchemists were doing. Even better, if you want to try out some of the experiments for yourself and learn how techniques like calcination or sublimation relate to your own human experience and how you can learn how to transform the lead in your life into something more gold. What we call in modern psychology, perhaps post-traumatic growth. That's what alchemy is for. So again, please join me. Now's a great time to join. We're not starting until January, but go to www.magicandmastery.com/coven, sign yourself up, and join the adventure. The introduction that I did a few years ago to alchemy is also in there already. So waiting for you as soon as you join is the first inklings. We're going to give another introduction before we dive into the program, but at least you could get started. As I said, plus there's already 50 some odd hours of other material you can be binge watching over the holidays. And there you have it. Why alchemy is so very cool. And a little bit of insight into why I give you an experiment to do every week, because I love alchemy. I do. I love alchemy. I need to have a t-shirt made. So for your experiment this week, let's keep it simple and pick something in your ordinary, everyday world. I'm thinking about the sparkling water that I have here on my desk. And take that everyday, ordinary object, whether it be cooking food or something else that you do, and meditate with it. And consider how what you are observing could be related to a process within yourself. So for example, my bubbles here, I can think about where those bubbles come from, how they float up to the top. In some ways, it's like little thought bubbles that float up to the surface of my awareness. Where do those little thought bubbles come from? And I can use that dual meditation of focus on the bubbles to feel into how the process inside me is also working. Try that. It's one of the secrets of magic. You can start anywhere and get results because eventually all things lead back to exactly where you need them to. Once again, I hope you enjoyed this week's discussion on all things alchemical. If you would like to join us for our 2022 Year of Alchemy journey, again, please go over to www.magicandmastery.com/coven. Be sure to use the special code. Because there's been so much interest in alchemy, we've actually extended the sale out another few days, so use the code HOLIDAYLOVE to get your extra days to claim your discount. Of course, if you're interested in the timestamps and links to things that I mentioned during the show, please feel free to go over to the podcast show notes at www.magicandmastery.com/podcast. We'll also include a link on how you can join the coven so you can get access to that year of alchemy as it's unfolding. As always, I'm so grateful that you tuned in to yet another episode of the Magic and Mastery podcast with me, Donna Woodwell, your host. I love going on this adventure with you. And if you've been following along with this podcast, why don't you take a moment to rate and review the podcast so that we know what you love and can keep bringing you more of it. And if you really like it, why don't you share it with a friend?